everyone, Vincenzo Cali here with VCalla Productions. Today I'm sitting here with Stephanie Levitz, who is a Toronto Star journalist at the Parliament Hill Bureau here in Ottawa. Today we'll talk a bit about Stephanie's career and her job as covering federal politics for the Toronto Star. So thanks, Stephanie, for your time, and welcome to the VCalla Show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So first off, it's great to have you. And can you tell me a bit about yourself, who you are, and how you got your start in journalism?
Sure. As a kid, I was a big reader, a really big reader, like all sorts of books, all sorts of everything. And I always often thought that I wanted to be a writer one day, that that's what I wanted to do. And then I got into high school. And as often happens, along the way, you have some excellent teachers. And I had a teacher who really opened up my mind towards history and political science and the fact how important it was to think and talk about that stuff. And I got really into researching and writing papers in high school, and it's a bit wonky or whatever. And it quickly became apparent to me that real life was more interesting than anything that I could ever possibly make up. And so it became, I'm talking like grade 9, grade 10. I was like, you know what? No, I think I want to be a journalist. I think that's what I want to do. So it's all I've ever wanted to do since I was in high school. And that's basically how I got my start. When I was growing up, the local paper had a teen page in it. I used to write stories for that, articles for that. I went off and did an undergrad, a general arts degree. I wrote for the campus paper for many years. I freelanced, and I've just sort of always hustled my way through. Eventually went to graduate school in journalism. So I have a graduate degree in that now. And yeah, I've been working full time as a reporter for unbelievably about 20 years.
So let's talk a bit about that now. So you had this journey, you were a kid sort of interested in journalism and you went through school and you became a journalist. So what brought you to the Toronto Star? What made you join and be a reporter for the Toronto Star?
Sure. So a bit of context. I've only been in the Star's Parliament Hill Bureau for 2 years. Before that, I worked for the Canadian Press, which is Canada's national newswire agency. And they're the folks I started working with right at the outset of my journalism career. It's a bit of a long story, but suffice to say, I got a job with them and I loved the wire. I loved everything about wire reporting. And for your viewers, wire reporting is the history of the Canadian press is really important. Where it comes from is a desire of all the Canadian newspapers during the First World War to have eyes on the battlefield in Europe and to be able to tell Canadians what was happening. So they all pooled together their resources and they created something known as the Canadian Press. So they could send over one reporter to send the news back to Canadians. And that was that ethos, that spirit of just being there, being where it happens, being able to tell people what's going on, write that first draft of history. That was really important to me. And that meant a lot to me to work for The Wire. And I worked for them for many, many years. And then there comes a time in everybody's career where you think, hey, you know what? I think I'd like to do something a little bit different. I'd like to try a different style of journalism. So a couple of years back, an old boss and mentor of mine had gone over to the Toronto Star. They were looking for another reporter here in Ottawa. And I thought, you know what, that'd be a good fit. It's a different kind of writing, a different kind of audience, different kind of way to think about what I do, the craft that I practice. And so I decided to take the leap and make the change. And I've been with the Star now a couple of years.
So we'll talk a bit more about that later, but first I want to talk about some of your key moments and achievements and experiences in your career. So I want to first off, what have been some of the key moments for you in your career as a journalist over the years you have been covering politics and covering being a journalist in general? What have been some of those key moments for you?
Sure. I mean, I've been very, very fortunate in my career. I have been all over the world. I have seen a lot of things. I have been in the room where it happened. Probably the assignment that has stayed with me most directly is covering the war in Afghanistan. I was embedded with the Canadian military twice over the course of the military mission in Kandahar. And so I spent several weeks on the ground with soldiers, getting to understand the conflict, watching Canada's participation in it. And that was really some of the most meaningful work that I think I will probably ever do in my career. I really believed in the importance of having eyes on what we were trying to achieve in Afghanistan, asking the questions about whether we were achieving that. And it, in terms of a life experience, unparalleled, I guess to say. And I'm not trying to romanticize it. It was very hard. It was very scary. But I will say that is an experience that sticks with me to this day. In terms of memories that I have. I've done other neat things. Back in my career with the Canadian Press, I was often the only reporter inside meetings between world leaders like Stephen Harper and Barack Obama. I traveled with Stephen Harper all over the world in all sorts of places, which has been really cool. I've done a lot of election coverage, which I love being on the road for elections. I think watching democracy in action is an incredible opportunity. And because I'm based in Ottawa, any time to get out of the bubble, as I say, is a great time because it allows you to talk to people on the ground. What are they thinking? What are they feeling? Set eyes on a place. Some of my other sort of like big assignments is I covered the 2010 Vancouver Winter Olympics as a news reporter. So that was a lot of fun. I don't know a lot about sports. Don't ask me any sporting questions. When Canada scored the golden goal in that Olympics, I was racing down the hallway to catch a bus and I could hear all these cheering. I was like, I guess something just happened. I don't know. I have to go. So people say that, I've got my media pass here and it's like it's a backstage access pass to life. And I get to see a lot of things and hopefully take Canadians through my work into places where they wouldn't be able to go and pull back the curtain of power and explain to people how things happen here in Ottawa, how they happen in government, and why politics matters to their lives and why it should matter. And so I consider the entirety of it, I guess, a privilege is what I'm saying, that I just never gets old coming up the hill. And I've had a lot of cool assignments. I've done a lot of cool things. But yeah, I don't take any of it for granted.
And before we go on to the next question, something just sort of sparked my interest there, and you were talking about sort of being sometimes being one of the only people in the room with sort of like when there's these meetings or these sorts of things, and kind of when there's meetings between world leaders and all that. As a journalist, do you sort of get an opportunity to sort of like say hello to the person or like say hi to them, or what's that like to sort of be in the same room as some of the most influential people that this world currently has or has had?
No, you never get a chance. It's not an engagement. I mean, different
Yeah, of
leaders
course.
handle it differently. What you're there to do is just record the moment and then get shuffled out of the room, more or less. But you always try, and I have colleagues that are better at this than I am, but you generally try to take a moment and appreciate where you are, and to realize what you're seeing and how can you record it accurately, and what about this and what about that. Your eye has to sharpen for detail. Oh, they shook hands for this and oh that. And some of it's just color and it's not really going to tell you much. I think that, the moments that I'm privileged to have had are where you get to see politicians being human, the off the cuff moments, the being on the plane with them, the where you get to, talk to them and sort of learn about them in a different way than the cut and thrust of the scrum or the formality of an interview and all of that stuff. And to, again, the central goal here, holding the government to account and trying to let people know about their elected leaders, what they're up to, what they think, what they read, what's influencing them, why do they want to be in government or why don't they want to be in government, so it's all a piece of that. But no, you don't get, unfortunately, like I have no great stories about, hey, that time, Donald Trump and I or Barack Obama and I shared a joke. Like I don't have any of that. My best is like I was assigned to cover many years ago the funeral of Margaret Thatcher. And I was in the church and I had to leave immediately. There was no good cell signal inside the church. So I had to file my story as soon as the funeral was over. So I come running out of the church and I'm running down a stairway and I come around a corner and I smash right into Boris Johnson. And all of my stuff goes flying. It was like a meet cute in a movie. And he's all Boris Johnson and he's, oh, let me help you. And I'm like, oh, Mr. Johnson. And it was just very, you get like one story like that in your entire career. There's mine. I ran smack into Boris Johnson.
Very interesting, sort of what I was interested in, and pretty interesting too to sort of hear that. And those little things are interesting. And I want to move on now to talk a bit about your work with the Toronto Star. So a lot of people, I sort of hear this sometimes. People are like, oh, Toronto Star, why should I listen to them? They're a Toronto newspaper. But explain a bit, being a national journalist covering national politics for all Canadians through the Toronto Star. Can you explain a bit to the audience who may be unclear about the Toronto Star?
Yeah, I'm not sure what they're unclear of. Like, the
Well,
Toronto Star
they
is
think like
Canada's
Toronto
largest.
Star. I've met some people who think that the Toronto Star is a Toronto newspaper. So it's sort of like,
Well, I mean, sure. Like, it actually
yeah,
is a Toronto newspaper, right?
yeah,
Like, it does.
yeah.
Its
But
main
what's that
readership
like,
is
sort of
Toronto.
covering? Yeah,
Um, so I mean, taking on the job of covering Parliament Hill for the Toronto Star, I think that there's two things that the Star is really trying to do, and one, obviously, is interpret what's happening in Ottawa for the readership of the Toronto Star, and the vast majority of that readership is in fact in Toronto. That being said, though, it's not as though, read through like anything I've written. It's not like every story features every single Toronto area MP, or references a Toronto intersection, or, things like that, right? National politics are of relevance to the readers in Toronto, just as they're the relevance to the readers in Saskatoon or Vancouver or Halifax. We do, try at the Star sometimes to think about, okay, why would this be relevant to Toronto Star readers? And I think that's the challenge up here, is that a lot of the stuff that happens is sometimes perceived as like Ottawa bubble stuff,
Mhm.
and it's only of relevance if you follow politics or it's interesting. But my job and my singular challenge is to be able to write in a way and report in a way that helps make it meaningful for people. And there's certain things, like, for sure, I'm trying to think of a good recent issue. I don't know how familiar your viewers would be really about the recent story in the news about Paul Bernardo, who is a convicted murderer, with in a series of incidents that I think truly shocked the nation when they happened a number of years ago. But there's a lot of folks, of course, who don't remember that anymore. But in Toronto, in that area, that was a massive story at the time, because the murders were in St. Catharines, which was near Toronto, and so as that issue bubbles up here in Ottawa, that might be something that we say, okay, let's seize on that. Let's try and drive that, because for our readership, that's pretty important. And we think about that from other issue sets too. What are the issue sets that are really relevant and meaningful to the folks in Toronto? And so how can we, take on our responsibility, government accountability, drawing back the curtain of power, helping people understand what's going on? Do we need to hit on themes or touch on subjects that perhaps are of, primary importance to the readership in Toronto? And again, I'm not saying that like housing is as important in Halifax as it is, but we might choose to focus on, federal government funding for housing in Metro Toronto in particular, right? We might narrow cast it down. But generally speaking, I think what we're also trying to do is acknowledge the fact, as my bureau does, that not only is the Toronto Star, the largest newspaper in the country, it serves the largest city in the country, and by virtue of that, it's a more of a national approach that we want the paper to have coming out of Ottawa, to position itself as a national paper via its national political coverage, so that what I write or my colleagues write is of relevance and as relevant to someone who lives anywhere in this country. You do not have to live in Toronto to understand, Pierre Poilievre's latest argument, or Justin Trudeau's latest scandal, or his defense, or, the Liberals' work on climate change versus the Conservatives' fight on something else. Like, all that stuff matters. Doesn't matter where you live.
And that was sort of what I was getting at with that question, especially as sort of it was a good lead into this next question, with sort of the expanded base you may have with social media. So I know that it's very easy to sort of tweet a Toronto Star link, and sort of like people all over Canada will see that and sort of read it, and positioning like a sort of a national base like you were mentioning. And what has that been like for you as a journalist, to sort of see the increasingness of social media, to cover the bases of social media through reaching so many more people, and how has that impacted your work, the fact that you're sort of looking at bringing your message through the Toronto Star, whereas, say, you may just have a politician who may say, oh, why, I'll just bring my message directly to the people through social media. What has been sort of the challenges and some of the changes you've had to sort of see with the increased use of social media in politics and journalism today?
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, there's different ways to look at it. I think one of the challenges is the increased use of social media as the de facto communications tool for the government. And I mean, I'm just talking specifically now about the government, as opposed to like the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party. So often now you'll have an issue bubbling up in the press. You'll have some questions. You'll wonder, well, what does agency X have to say? And what does cabinet minister have to say? And you're told, well, just go find their statement on Twitter. And you think, well, yes, I am paid to know what is going on, and I am paid to ask questions. And part of that is being on Twitter. But this default that, oh, well, if the minister issued a statement on Twitter, or the department put out a thing on Twitter, that's the default. And it's like, yeah, but that doesn't answer my questions. Like, their statement on social media does not answer my questions. I have all of these questions. Or, hey, I'm not on social media 24/7. And no, I did not know that the minister tweeted at 4 o'clock. And how come you didn't tell anybody? So there's that part of it, in terms of, the government just uses it as a default communications tool, as opposed to a supplementary communications tool, for lack of a better word. I think there's lots of value in terms of getting message out for the government on social media, but they haven't seemed to find that balance between, you know, answering questions and just putting out statements. I think social media is also, I can't think of the word that I'm looking for. It's a bit of a rage factory on there. Like, you know, he who shouts the loudest or says the most aggressive thing is the one who wins the day on social. And I don't think that contributes to the health of our political discourse. I'm old in that way. I mean, I guess you could look at question period and ask whether that contributes to the health of our political discourse. And perhaps the answer there too is no. But, you know, videos and clips, I think what we're seeing even more so now is a spillover between what is happening in the House of Commons and the extent to which what is happening is designed for clips to go viral on social media, as opposed to being designed to educate the public, get answers out of the government, clearly and succinctly state a point of view. It's being engineered to go viral on social media. And now you're seeing a crossover of that language, that tactic, that umbrage, that outrage. I think that's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate that politicians would rather just put out their statement than be accountable for the things they are saying. I think social media allows them to escape accountability. And in which I mean, they don't need to be challenged. They decide they just don't want to be challenged on what they have to say. Their word is the fact. They do not need to take questions. They've already said their piece. Well, what if you have questions about their piece? What if you'd like to understand a little bit more about their policy? And it's like, nope, I've already put a clip out on social. That's all you get. So I find it a bit of a double-edged sword. And I also, I mean, every social media platform that's out there right now has different pros and different cons attached to it. The toxicity on Twitter in particular is, again, unfortunate. I think there's a censorship effect that happens. There's a chill because people are afraid. You know, there are people who aren't afraid. They just say whatever they want on there. And I think there's a lot of people who would probably engage a little bit more, but they're really shy because if you know, one person reads your sentence the wrong way, and all of a sudden you're caught up in this, like, you know, hate-filled barrage of tweets, or as happened to me quite recently as this morning, you make a typo in a tweet and suddenly everybody accuses you of being biased, and it's literally just a typo, you know, and then you have to deal with the ramifications of seeing your mentions filled up with horrible things, and you think all I did was make a typo. So I'm not sure. Like I don't know. It kind of screws with our political mindset, I think, in a way. It makes certain things seem bigger than they are. It makes small things amplified too much. We lose track of the plot. There's lots of problems with it, as much as it does allow you to connect to people. And I like that aspect of it very much. I like being able to hear from respectful people who want to respectfully engage. And, you know, I think that part of it is great.
And finally, now, I guess I just want to ask you, what do you sort of see as the future of covering politics in Ottawa? You were mentioning a lot how things are changing. Politicians go straight to social media. They sort of don't take questions sometimes. I see this sometimes. They don't take questions or something like that. How does that impact your work? And what do you see as the future of sort of keeping the government, keeping politicians to account, and sort of bringing your message and bringing what the people want to hear to them? How do you sort of, what do you see as the future of your job, of journalism in national politics and journalism in general?
The future of journalism depends on finding a financial model that supports the future of journalism. Full stop. If we cannot, and when I say we, I mean in the aggregate, we the media, we the industry, even though there is no such aggregate beast. But if the various media agencies that exist in this country, legacy media as they're referred to, so a place like I work, more new media outlets, different ways, if they can't find a way to be financially self-sustainable and pay for what journalism costs, there is no journalism. I mean, that I know that sounds really bleak and dismal, but just to give a frame of reference that I don't think a lot of people know, and it's an example I use a lot, when reporters go on election campaigns or they travel with the prime minister, again, of any party, anywhere in the world, that costs money. Like to take a trip with the prime minister to the G7, let's say, and usually they tack on another trip, we're talking like 10 to 15 to $20,000. It can be that much to cover an election campaign for 1 week. But people don't want to pay for the news anymore. They don't want to subscribe to newspapers. They don't. And there's lots of different models people are trying that are working. I'm not knocking it. There's, you know, sort of sponsorship kind of models. I can't think of the website. Patron,
Patreon.
like the one.
Patreon, yeah.
Patreon, thank you.
Yeah.
But the reality is, unless the industry finds a way to pay for journalism Opinion is free. Journalism costs money. To do the work, to do the legwork, to get out there, to talk to people, to understand what's going on, that costs money to do. And nobody disputes that. But no one has yet managed to find a financially viable way to keep it going. So that's the issue. And we can talk a lot about, like, the existential bits of the craft in terms of concerns about bias, objectivity, and access to politicians, and the fact that our access to information system is broken, you can't get answers, and the government refuses to answer questions, or the partisanship of the day is this, that, or the other. But again, it all goes back to, if there's no way to financially support the people who are asking questions, then the questions just aren't going to get asked. And who knows what happens when that, and I think of all the folks in this country who live in what are known as news deserts. They have no local newspaper anymore. They have no local radio station anymore. Who's holding the politicians to account? Who's doing that work? And, do we as a society value that? Or do we think that our politicians should be able to act unfettered and unchecked? I don't think we believe that. But then we've got to figure out a way to hold them to account a lot better than we're doing right now.
And that's sort of what I have for questions today. Thank you for joining me. Do you have anything else you want to mention before we go?
Subscribe. Subscribe to a newspaper for only
It's
$1 a
important.
day. You too can save democracy. I'm
It's
just joking,
important.
but I think it's important. I think it's important that people read. I think it's important that they watch and that they listen, and that they listen to a variety of sources. Let themselves be challenged. Let themselves hear other points of view, because I think that's really important too, and we don't do enough of it.
And that's what we're lacking, even if you don't believe in something, listen to the other side. Listen to
Just
it.
listen.
Just
You don't have
listen,
to
hear it
change your
out.
mind. Just listen.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
and you may understand why another side may think the way they think if you just hear it out. And it's such an important way of doing politics. And politics is changing, journalism is changing, and the best we can do is sort of listen and go for it. So thanks, Stephanie, for joining
my
me. It was
pleasure.
fantastic to have you today.
Thanks for having me on.
So the VCalla Show is a VCalla production. Until the next video, I'm Vincenzo Calla, signing out.